A winter afternoon. 5 young men sped by on roaring motorbikes, laughing loudly as they shoved an old man to the ground in front of an old watch shop. No one spoke up. No one stepped forward. But just an hour later, the entire town held its breath when they saw Chuck Norris quietly appear beside the old man. No punches needed, no threats. Just a few words were enough to make the whole community kneel before their own conscience. The winter wind had begun to sweep down from the Colorado mountains, slipping through the cobbled streets, brushing past peeling white fences, sneaking into every crack of a town long accustomed to silence. A tiny brass bell hanging above the door of the watch shop jingled faintly each time the wind brushed it. A lonely sound on an early, empty morning. Thomas Callahan, Tom, as everyone called him, sat behind the old oak counter, eyes focused on a brass-colored pocket watch. He lifted a magnifying glass to his eye, his thin, trembling fingers still carefully rotated each tiny screw, adjusting the gears inside. On the table, wall clocks, pocket watches, and desk clocks lay spread out like a silent orchestra, each ticking second a steady note, offering him comfort in a world that had increasingly forgotten him. Tom was 82, tall and thin, his gait slightly hunched, his hair a thick, neat white, as though he had never allowed himself to grow sloppy. The blue sweater he wore, knitted by his late wife Martha nearly 30 years ago, was worn at the shoulders, but Tom still put it on every morning, a way of keeping Martha close. On the wall behind the counter, a black and white photograph glowed softly inside a cherry wood frame. Tom and Martha, on their wedding day, beaming amid loved ones. Back then, Tom's eyes sparkled like twin flames, proud and full of life. The little shop sat on the corner of Main Street, once bustling in the 60s and 70s sessions, when the whole town gathered on weekends to shop and socialize. But time passed. Supermarkets rose on the town's outskirts, malls appeared, and the small stores grew empty, then faded away. Tom's watch shop, by some miracle, or perhaps only his own persistence, held on, still lit, still clinging to its few loyal customers. Outside, grey clouds blanketed the sky, dim light reflecting off the dusty window pane. A red SUV with off-road tires roared up, stopping recklessly at the shop's door, flinging gravel everywhere. Tom flinched, nearly dropping his tweezers. He looked up, squinting at 4 or 5 young men stepping out, laughing loudly. Leather jackets, hooded beanies, phones in hand, and that self-satisfied look Tom had seen too many times before. Kids who had never known hardship, only indulgence. "Oh man, what kind of dump is this?" one laughed, pointing at the faded Callahan's watch repair sign under the awning. "Still breathing, old man?" "Look at that, tick-tocking like some black and white movie," another sneered, raising his phone to record. "Let's post this on TikTok for kicks." Tom took a deep breath. He folded his cleaning cloth neatly, set it on the table, and stood up. Every step felt weighted, not from physical exhaustion, but from the invisible fatigue that had clung to him for years, the feeling of becoming invisible in the very community that had once spoken his name with respect. "What can I help you with, boys?" His voice was low, steady, not sharp, not pleading, just like a bell ringing at twilight. "Hey, Gramps," one smirked. "You selling any of these? I want to buy one. Smash it for fun." Laughter echoed. A taller kid casually walked in, picked up a pocket watch from the table, tossing it up and down like a ball. Tom stepped forward, hand outstretched, but the kid was quicker, pulling it back. "Careful," Tom said, his breath unsteady. "That's a keepsake." "A keepsake, huh?" The kid scoffed. "Even better. Rare stuff's worth more, right?" A soft clink. The watch hit the tiled floor, the cover snapping open, gears scattering. Tom froze. At that moment he didn't just see a broken object. He saw Martha, her gentle smile, her hand dusting the watch face, disappear before his eyes. "Let's go, bored now," the ringleader waved. Let's find something more fun." Before walking out, he glanced at Tom, grinning widely. "Hey, old man, this place would make a great drift track." The door slammed shut, laughter echoing down the empty street. Tom stood still for a long moment. Outside, snow had started to fall, tiny flakes touching the window pane, melting into droplets. He knelt, gathering the pieces, his hands shaking. No one on the street stopped. A young woman walking by tugged her little boy quickly past, eyes averted. A middle-aged mailman glanced, then bowed his head, walking faster. Another old man in a motorized scooter sighed but said nothing. Through the whistling wind, Tom heard echoes of the past. Fire truck sirens, screams, the sound of burning floorboards beneath his feet. His heart pounding as he cradled the wet, blanketed child racing out of a collapsing house. So many years had passed, so many sleepless nights, so many scars hidden beneath the sweater. All just to end up here, crouched over broken pieces, with no one stopping to ask. He returned behind the counter, dragged out an old wooden chair, and sat, face buried in his hands. A tear slid down, not from pain, not from anger, but from loss. The loss of believing he still had a place in the heart of this little town. On the wall, the wedding photo of Tom and Martha quietly watched. At that moment, Tom thought he had heard Martha whisper, "Tom, don't fall." But he was too tired, too alone to answer. Outside, the wind chime jingled again. Snow fell heavier, covering the shop sign, blurring the cracks on the glass door. The little town sank into the grey afternoon, and inside the old shop, an old man sat quietly, his head bowed among shattered watches in a world that had turned its face away. The evening light stretched long over the faded red brick walls. Inside the shop, the warm yellow light cast gentle shadows on Tom's face, deep grooves like winding little roads that told the story of a long, stormy life. He braced his hands on the table, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes. Memories flooded back, not in a rush, not chaotic but slow, soft, like the fine dust clinging to the window pane. Back then, Tom was just over 20, the youngest firefighter on the town's crew, a brown-haired, blue-eyed young man brimming with energy. When the alarm sounded, he was the first to leap onto the truck, the last to leave the scene. Once, when flames surrounded a wooden house, Tom ran in, wrapped a child in a wet blanket, and sprinted through the wall of fire, leaving behind a pair of scorched boots, but saving the lives of 3 people. Martha first met Tom not at a dance, not at a cafe, but right there on the doorstep of that burned house. She was a nurse who was dispatched to assist at the scene. When she saw Tom emerge, shoulder bleeding, eyes still anxiously scanning the house, Martha thought, "This man, his heart is somewhere behind the flames." They fell in love quietly, simply, like everything else in a small town. Evening walks around the square, sharing a buttered scone. Weekend mornings with Martha reading by the counter while Tom worked on watches, occasionally glancing up to smile at her. When Martha passed away 10 years ago, Tom quietly closed the shop for a week, then reopened it, without announcement, without fanfare, just to tell himself, "I must go on." The wind chime stirred again. Tom opened his eyes, looking outside. Only his blurred reflection in the window stared back at him. He smiled faintly, not bitterly. It was the smile of a man who had seen both light and darkness, and had come to understand that life owed him nothing. He stood and walked to the old wooden shelf in the corner. His hand groped for the bottom drawer. Inside, among old order slips, leftover watch springs, and a few silver coins from the 60s, was a yellowed envelope, wrinkled with age. In thick, firm handwriting at the corner of the envelope, Chuck Norris. Tom pulled out the envelope and sat back down. His fingertip traced the paper's surface. the memory vivid as if it were yesterday. The day Chuck left town after the old fire crew's memorial service, when some had changed careers and others were no longer here. Chuck had placed the letter in Tom's hand, saying simply, "You saved my family, Tom. If you ever need me, just call." Tom had never called, not once. He had always told himself, "I'm fine." Even when Marta passed, even when his legs grew weak, his hands began to tremble. Even when old friends left, the town changed, and familiar faces disappeared. He kept telling himself, "I'm fine." But today, seeing the shattered watch, remembering those contemptuous young faces, hearing the echoing jeers, Tom felt something crack inside. Not from being knocked down, but from being forgotten. He pulled out the letter. The paper was yellowed, and the corners were slightly torn. The handwriting firm and familiar. "Tom, you were always the one who kept the fire alive for all of us. If the fire ever fades inside you, let me rekindle it. Chuck." Tom sat frozen. All his life, he had never been the one to call for help. As a firefighter, a hero didn't ask to be saved. As a husband, a pillar of the home, he never leaned on anyone. But now, inside the quiet watch shop in the falling twilight, a soft whisper entered his heart. "Maybe it's time, Tom. Maybe just this once." The door chime jingled, not from the wind this time. Tom jolted, looking up. Outside, the silhouette of a man appeared. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the grace of an old mountain lion. Before Tom could rise, the door swung open, and a deep, warm voice filled the air. Not rushed, not loud, just as natural as a breath. "You didn't call, but I knew." Chuck Norris stepped inside, dark grey eyes sweeping the room, stopping on the broken watch on the table. He picked it up, turned it over, his mouth tightening slightly. Then, with a natural motion, he sat in the chair across from Tom, resting his elbows on his knees, as if they had parted only yesterday, as if the decades had melted away. Tom couldn't speak. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from something that hadn't visited in a long time. The stirring of a man who thought he'd been forgotten. Chuck smiled softly, giving a small wink. "Still fixable," he murmured, voice light as a passing breeze. Then, as if no one needed to ask, he added, "This shop is beautiful, Tom, but the man sitting in it, even more beautiful." Outside, snow kept falling, but inside the watch shop, winter seemed to pause. Two men, two worlds, two lives intersected at one point, friendship, loyalty, and a promise never forgotten. Tom leaned back in his chair, covering his eyes, then chuckled. A thin, uneven laugh, but the laugh of a man who had just seen the sun break through after a long storm. As Chuck Norris quietly sat across from him, the little watch shop seemed to release a long-held sigh it had kept in for many years. Tom remained still, fingers lightly squeezing the old letter. He looked at his old friend, his eyes misting over, not from age, but from the unexpected rush of memory stirring his soul. For a brief moment, Tom felt young again, like the night he first met Martha under the soft glow of a street lamp, or the day he first donned his firefighter uniform, heart pounding fiercely in his chest. Morrisa. Her name drifted into Tom's mind as softly as the scent of lavender wafting through the garden. Tom remembered vividly the afternoon they first met. He had slumped on the charred doorstep, hands still trembling from adrenaline, eyes fixed blankly ahead, not yet comprehending what had just happened. Martha had approached, sat beside him without fuss, without chatter, and simply handed him a bottle of water. "Drink," she'd said, her voice gentle. "You need to keep your strength." That day, Tom didn't know he needed someone to sit quietly beside him. But Martha had taught him one of life's greatest lessons. Sometimes, the quiet presence of another is the most powerful healing. They married after 2 years of dating in a simple ceremony surrounded by the laughter of teammates and neighbors. Martha became Tom's home, the gentle hand brushing soot from his face after each shift, the soft voice lulling him to sleep on weary nights. She was the first to suggest opening the watch shop when Tom retired, turning his passion for delicate mechanisms into a place that preserved memories. In those days, the shop buzzed with laughter. Children brought Mickey Mouse watches to fix, adults came in to adjust wedding watches, and firefighters dropped off pocket watches for new batteries. Martha would often sit by the window, embroidering, occasionally glancing at Tom with a smile. It was a simple life, one Tom had believed would last forever. But then, Martha was diagnosed with cancer. Tom remembered the last time he saw her smile. Not on the hospital bed, not at the church, but at the shop, on a chilly early winter morning like this one. Martha had grown frail, but insisted on sitting at the counter, working on her unfinished embroidery. When the last customer left, she looked at Tom, smiled, and said, "You know these ticking sounds. They're the music of my life." That day, for the first time, Tom cried in front of her. After Martha passed, the shop fell silent, but Tom kept the old rhythm: open in the morning, wipe the watches, serve the customers, close at night, jot down the day's notes. He lived like a keeper of time, alone amid the steady tick of passing seconds. Chuck watched Tom for a long moment, not interrupting. The man understood exactly what was stirring in his friend's heart. He had heard of Martha, had received the mourning letter from Tom, and had once thought of calling to open condolences, but stopped himself, knowing Tom was not the type to open his heart over the phone. Now, sitting here, Chuck quietly turned the broken watch over in his hand, letting Tom find his own way back. Outside, the afternoon was fading. A group of students passed by, chattering and laughing, but when they caught sight of Chuck through the window, they slowed, puzzled. A man across the street, the bakery owner, froze. The town began to whisper. The rumor spread quickly, no need for social media. Chuck Norris is at Tom Callahan's watch shop. Tom braced himself on the table, looked up at Chuck, his voice hoarse. "You know, there were times I thought I'd become a piece of junk." Chuck raised an eyebrow, not smiling but tilting his head slightly, the way someone listens when they don't agree. "You were never junk, Tom. You're the kind of person others need, even when they don't know they need you." Tom gave a faint nod. In his eyes something broke open, not pain, but the hard shell that had held in years of loneliness. A deep breath, a skipped heartbeat, and then he gave a faint laugh, shaking his head. "I'm old, Chuck. They're young, strong. How could I stand against that?" Chuck placed the broken watch on the table, folded his arms, and his gaze was firm. Some things don't require strength, just someone willing to stand tall. At that moment, outside on the street, the group of young men returned, engines roaring, laughter echoing down the block. But this time, the town didn't shut its doors. A few windows cracked open. The baker paused at the counter. The bookstall owner lifted his head. A mother held her child's hand, but didn't retreat from the porch. Inside the shop, Tom and Chuck sat like two silent monuments in the middle of an approaching storm. Tom looked out the window, saw his reflection blending with the scene outside, and realized, all these years, he thought he had been fighting alone. But sometimes, just one person standing up was enough to remind the world of what it had forgotten. He squeezed Chuck's hand lightly, his voice trembling but steady. "Thank you, Chuck. Thank you for remembering." Chuck squeezed back, eyes glinting with a faint smile. "You saved my life when I was a kid. Now it's my turn to remind this town who you are." Outside, the engines stopped. One of the boys kicked at the shop door, his voice slurring. "Hey, old man, you done yet? We're here to pick up the rest of that junk." Tom exhaled slowly. He stood, his stiff legs creaking. He didn't need a mirror to know his back no longer stood straight. His shoulders had slumped. But one thing had never faded, the look in the eyes of a man who once ran into burning houses, not for glory, but out of instinct to save. "Let's go," Tom said, eyes flashing with a sharp glint. "Let them know I'm still here." Chuck stood, slowly brushing dust from his jacket, his grey eyes looking out the window, his lips pressed into a thin line of determination. And in that moment the entire town held its breath, though none of them fully understood why. Behind them the wall clocks chimed in unison. Outside the sun had slipped past the mountain ridge. On the table the broken watch glimmered in the warm yellow light. And inside Tom, an old, worn-out heartbeat suddenly pulsed with renewed strength, as if he could hear Martha whisper in his ear, "Stand tall, Tom. You were never alone." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the town square. Inside the watch shop, Tom poured 2 cups of tea from a tarnished brass pot. His movements were slow, but there was a quiet beauty in that slowness, the beauty of someone who had weathered many storms, no longer rushed, no longer racing against time, but careful, deliberate, as if each small act carried its own quiet meaning. "Do you ever feel," Tom whispered, his voice thin, "like a broken clock?" Chuck looked up, squinting slightly, not in surprise, but in respect for the honesty behind the question. Tom glanced down at his hands, hands that had once lifted burning beams, once adjusted the tiniest watch screws, now speckled with age spots, trembling ever so slightly. "I used to think, when I got old, I'd have time to enjoy things. But no one told me how lonely that would feel." Memories swept in like cold wind through a crack in the window. Tom recalled Martha's final days, the hiss of the oxygen machine, the smell of antiseptic, her hands growing smaller in his. He had promised to go on, to live for both of them, but as old friends passed, as regular customers moved away, as the town shifted and new faces replaced the familiar, his shop became a shadow on the edge of a changing world. At night, the ticking of the clocks echoed through the shop, not as a comforting soundtrack anymore, but as a whispering reminder. Everything moves forward, only you remain. There were nights Tom stood before the mirror, pulling off his old blue sweater, gazing at his thin body, the sagging skin, the faint burn scar on his shoulder from years ago. He would let out a gravelly laugh, half bitter, half tender. Firefighters don't die easy. But surviving, sometimes that was the hardest part. Tom told Chuck about the glory days. The day he and his crew rescued a family of 3 from a burning wooden house. The day the mayor pinned a medal on his chest, Martha clapped below the stage until her palms turned red. The day they opened the watch shop, with townsfolk lining up in support, Martha beaming, teasing, "Look at my famous husband." And then his voice softened. The day the firehouse closed due to a lack of funding. The day Marta left. The day the last regular customer moved to the city. The day he realized no one had spoken his name in weeks. "I started wondering," Tom murmured, eyes glazing, "if I ever really mattered." Chuck didn't interrupt. He knew that at times like this, silence was the only real answer. The kind of silence that told a man he was being heard. Tom sipped his tea, the steam trembling at his lips. "Some nights I sit here," he said, "listening to the ticking, wondering, when I'm gone, who's going to wind these clocks? Or will they just stop forever and get tossed out as trash?" His voice turned wry, but the faint smile at his mouth trembled with pain. Chuck leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You know, Tom," he said, his gravelly voice soft, People don't remember the ones who come and go. They remember the ones who stay, the ones who keep the light burning through the night. And that's you. Tom closed his eyes, his shoulders shaking ever so slightly. Maybe he was holding back a sigh, maybe he was holding back tears. But in that moment, in that small shop, he no longer felt entirely alone. Outside, the engines revved again. Tom opened his eyes, glancing at the window. "Those boys," he said, weariness thick in his voice. "They don't know who I am. All they see is an old man, hunched over in a dusty shop." Chuck's lips curved into a quiet smile. "Then maybe it's time to remind them." Tom lifted his gaze to Chuck, and for the first time in a long while, there was a faint glimmer in his eyes. Not because Chuck was famous, not because Chuck was strong, but because Chuck had shown up. Because someone had sat down, stayed, and listened to the words Tom had never dared say aloud. They sat together, watching the street. The dark crept in, the street lights flickering like tired eyes. A stray cat padded across the road, tail flicking against the wind. The wind sighed through the eaves, leaves scraping the sidewalk. And in all that sound, Tom heard something new, the sound of company. "You know," Tom whispered, "I thought I'd die here, quietly. And maybe that was fine. But now, I'm not so sure." Chuck gave a soft pat to his shoulder. "You won't go quietly, Tom, I promise you that." That night, Tom stayed up in his chair at the shop, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the steady ticking of the clocks. His mind drifted. Martha, his old crew, the kids he'd pulled from burning houses, the customers who used to laugh at his counter, and now Chuck, sitting there beside him, quiet, steady, asking for nothing. Tom knew that soon he'd have to step outside and face the boys, face the town, face himself. But for tonight he just wanted to sit in the quiet, in the final moments where past and present mingled, when the ticking wasn't a reminder of time slipping away, but of all the moments he'd once lived. Outside, the snow fell heavily. Light from the street lamps shone through the window, casting shimmering patterns on the wood floor. Tom closed his eyes, and in the hush, he could almost hear Martha's voice. "You're still my hero, Tom. You always will be." That night, in a restless sleep, Tom dreamed of himself as a young man again. Running barefoot across the grass, laughter bursting in the air, Martha's hand pulling him forward, not back to the past, but toward the man he had always been, brave, loving, unwilling to quit. The next morning, as the sun crept over the mountains, Tom awoke, drawing in a deep breath that felt lighter in his chest. He rose, moved to the counter, and began winding each clock, wiping each glass, turning each screw. Slow, yes, but with a quiet new energy. The shop lights flickered on, and for the first time in years, Tom didn't feel like he was just keeping the clocks running. He was readying himself to rejoin the world. That's when Chuck tapped on the window, holding a steaming coffee cup, flashing his familiar grin. "Up early, old man?" Tom chuckled, stretching, back a little bent, but heart upright. "Today," he said firmly, "we're fixing more than clocks, Chuck." That morning the pale sunlight slipped through the grey clouds, gleaming off the faded wooden sign, "Callahan's Watch Repair." On the glass window, snow streaked in soft lines, reflecting the thin figure of Tom Callahan, who was carefully wiping the counter. Toot, toot, toot. Tom turned a pocket watch in his fingers, the inscription inside catching the light. "Forever yours, Martha." His chest tightened, but this time, instead of swallowing the ache, he exhaled a long, slow breath, letting go of some part of the weight he'd carried too long. He didn't hear the car pull up. He didn't hear the heavy footsteps crunching on snow. He didn't hear the gentle tapping on the glass. Only when the bell above the door jingled did Tom look up. Doc Norris walked in, a swirl of mountain air and leather and quiet strength. Worn brown jacket, faded jeans, scuffed boots, and those eyes. The same ones Tom had seen 50 years ago under the glow of a burning house. Eyes that had seen too much but had never learned to look away. "Old man," Chuck said softly, smiling. "Up early, huh?" Tom froze for a heartbeat. So many years had passed. Only Christmas cards, the occasional letter. Tom had never called, never written, "I need you." But last night, when the boys laughed, when the pocket watch shattered on the tile, when he sat silent in the dark, somehow the world had called for him. "Chuck," Tom rasped, his voice rough. "You really came?" Chuck nodded, stepping forward without hurry, as if they'd last seen each other just yesterday. From his jacket pocket he pulled 2 paper coffee cups, setting them on the counter. "Brought you one. I remember you like it black, no sugar." Tom let out a rough, surprised laugh, eyes glistening. "You remember that?" "You saved my family, Tom," Chuck murmured. "I remember everything." They sat, not talking for a long time, and in that silence Tom felt his heart soften, like an old wound finally touched with care. Not patched over, not rushed, just noticed. Outside, the town stirred. Someone walking by stopped, peered in and blinked in astonishment. A little girl tugged her mother's sleeve, pointing, "Mummy, look, it's Chuck Norris." Whispers rippled through the streets. Within half an hour, faces began appearing at windows. The baker, the barber, the postman, a few high school kids, even a couple of off-duty police officers. Everyone was watching the old watch shop, where, for the first time in years, the old man inside wasn't alone. Chuck broke the silence first. "Do you know why I'm here, Tom?" Tom raised an eyebrow, shrugged. "To drink coffee with a half-toothless old fool?" Chuck chuckled, clapping a hand on his friend's shoulder. "No. I'm here to remind you of something. You were never alone." Tom sat quietly, heart tightening. How long had he been lonely? Since Martha? Since the firehouse closed? Since the town shifted past him? He didn't know. All he knew was that someone was sitting here now, asking for nothing, offering everything. Outside, the red SUV roared down the street again, music blasting, laughter echoing. The boys were back. Chuck turned to the window, his eyes sharpening slightly. "Friends of yours?" Tom shook his head, lips pressing thin. "Just kids who don't know better?" Chuck rolled his shoulders, stretching like an old lion coming out of winter. "Maybe it's time for a little history lesson." Tom laughed softly. Not bitter, not broken, but real laughter, the kind that made his shoulders shake, the kind that had been buried deep under years of silence. The crowd outside had thickened. People gathered near the bakery, the barber shop, and the bookstall. Some leaned against lampposts, others sipped coffee, whispering to each other. Even people who usually hurried past the old watch shop now paused, watching silently through the frosted window. Chuck turned to Tom, giving him a light pat on the shoulder. "Want to come outside with me?" Tom took a deep breath, feeling something stir deep in his chest, a quiet strength that had slept for too long. His back was still bent, his legs still trembled slightly, but his eyes shone clear. "Let's go," Tom said. "Let's remind them who I am." The shop door swung open. The bell above the door jingled, sending a ripple through the crowd. 2 men, one old, one older, stepped out into the snowy street. Chuck stood tall, hands in his pockets, his gaze calm and unwavering. He didn't need to shout or raise a fist. His very presence spoke a language older than words, a language of dignity, of quiet power, of a life lived without bending. The boys in the SUV started laughing. One kicked at the snow, another spat on the sidewalk, another pulled out a phone to record. But the laughter faltered. One by one their eyes flicked from Chuck to Tom, to the growing crowd behind them. And then something unexpected happened. Tom stepped forward. He didn't yell. He didn't scold. He just spoke. Soft, firm, steady. You know, this used to be a town where people looked each other in the eye, a place where if someone fell, 3 hands would reach out to lift them. I don't know when we forgot that, but I know one thing. You weren't born to be like this. A hush fell over the square. Even the wind seemed to pause. Chuck stood by his side, nodding slightly, his eyes shining. "This isn't about me," Tom continued, his voice trembling but sure. "It's about all of us. Who are we when no one's watching?" One of the boys, the tallest, the one with the shaved head, lowered his gaze. Another licked his lips nervously. A third shifted his feet, casting a quick glance at the bakery window. And then Chuck spoke. 4 words, quiet, but clear enough to carry on the breeze. "It's time to remember." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of snow and fresh bread across the square. A small American flag on the lamppost fluttered softly. Birds scattered from the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed. And in that ordinary moment, something extraordinary unfolded. Tom stood, his old blue sweater dotted with snowflakes, his face lined and weathered, but filled with something the boys couldn't name. Chuck stood beside him, calm, immovable, patient as stone. The boys shifted uncomfortably. The tall one swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. The long-tailed one stuffed his hands deeper into his pockets. And slowly, the laughter drained away. From the crowd, people began stepping forward. The barber crossed his arms near the door. The bookstore owner wiped her hands on her apron. A young couple with a baby stopped at the edge of the sidewalk. No one spoke, but their presence was louder than words. Tom took another breath. For the first time in years, his chest opened fully, his breath steady and full. "I know," Tom said, his voice reaching the boys like a warm, slow current. "You didn't come here to hear a lecture. You just wanted fun. But listen to me. If fun comes at the cost of pushing someone down, of breaking what they love, then it stops being fun." The long-tiled boy's shoulders sagged. Another shuffled his shoes against the bricks, eyes on the ground. Tom took one step closer, his hands trembling slightly, but his gaze steady. "Do you know who I am?" he asked gently. "Do any of you know?" No answer. "That's all right," Tom nodded. "You don't have to. But let me tell you, I've pulled people from burning buildings. I've sat by the beds of the dying so they wouldn't have to leave this world alone, and I used to think maybe that was enough." He turned to glance at Chuck, a small smile playing at his lips. "But it turns out sometimes you need someone to remind the world who you are." Chuck gave a small shrug, his lips curving in a quiet smile. "No one lives a whole life without needing to be remembered, Tom." The bakery door opened. The elderly baker stepped out with a tray of cinnamon rolls, walking slowly across the square, placing them on a stone bench. She looked at Tom, gave a small nod, and turned back without a word. Then the gas station attendant came forward, carrying 2 bottles of water, and set them beside the tray. No one said anything, but something was building in the silence. From the end of the street, a boy of about 10 darted forward, pulling free from his mother's hand. "Mum, is that the fireman?" His mother bent down, whispering something in his ear. The boy ran to Tom, looking up, wide-eyed. "Thank you, sir." Tom's throat tightened. His weathered hand rested on the boy's head, rough fingers gently smoothing the child's hair. And in that moment, something shifted. Not just in Tom, but in everyone watching. Chuck stood quietly, arms crossed, his face softened with a quiet joy. He didn't need to step in. He didn't need to speak. He simply had to be there, a witness to a town remembering itself. Suddenly, the tall boy in the group mumbled, his voice cracking. "We didn't know." Tom lifted his gaze, the pale winter sun catching the edge of his grey eyes. "It's not too late to know, son." The long-tailed boy exhaled sharply, shoulders slumping. Another cursed softly under his breath, scuffing his boot against the lamppost. But none of them walked away. Not one. And somehow that was the first sign of something breaking open. From the crowd a man slowly emerged, the gas station owner, the one who usually turned a blind eye when the kids messed around. He scratched the back of his neck, sighed, and stepped toward Tom. "Tom, I'm sorry," he murmured. "I should have done something yesterday." Tom shook his head softly, a faint smile touching his lips. "Yesterday's gone, Jack. All we have left is today." And just like that, one by one, people began to move. Someone brought out folding chairs. Someone set a small bouquet by the shop window. Someone simply stood, arms crossed, their gaze no longer indifferent but watchful, present. Chuck watched it all, his eyes glimmering with quiet pride. He didn't need a medal. He didn't need a reporter's camera. He just needed this. Watching his old friend be restored to the place he always deserved, not on some stage of glory, but in the hearts of his neighbors. As afternoon faded to dusk, the sun stretched golden light across the street. Tom sat on the shop's stone steps, Chuck beside him. They said nothing, simply watching the town breathe, listening to the laughter of children, the tap of footsteps on brick, the faint chime of wind bells. Tom whispered, "You know, Chuck, I never thought I'd sit here and see all this happen." Chuck tilted his head, winking. "Guess you've been underestimating your town, old man." Tom let out a soft chuckle, a deep, warm sound that rolled up from his chest, the kind of laugh that only comes after you've lived long enough to know sorrow and still choose joy. As night fell, the square lit up in soft amber from street lamps. People gradually drifted home, but no one forgot to glance back at the watch shop. A young boy, just before leaving, waved enthusiastically. Tom lifted a trembling hand to wave back, his heart steady and full. Chuck stood, dusted off his jacket, and patted Tom's shoulder. "You remember now," he murmured. Tom looked up, his eyes shining. "Yeah," he whispered, "and so do I." The next morning, Tom rose early. Sunlight threaded through the window blinds, warming the lines on his face. He sat for a long while on the edge of his bed, his hands resting on his knees, listening to the steady ticking of the wall clock, a sound so familiar it felt like part of his own heartbeat. Today was no ordinary day. Today the mayor is coming. The news of Chuck Norris at the watch shop had spread across town like wildfire. But even more surprising was the second headline. The family of the tall, shaved-head boy, the son of the town's biggest banker, the mayor's grandson, was furious. At the town hall, a closed-door meeting was called. Not about violence, not about public safety, but about the image. "We can't let an old man and an action star disrupt the town," the mayor snapped, his face red with frustration. "What will the papers say? What will visitors think?" Meanwhile, Tom, dressed in his old blue sweater, walked down Main Street. His steps were slow but firm. People he passed nodded. Some smiled, some waved. Chuck walked beside him, relaxed, as if they were just two old friends going for a stroll. They stopped at the town square, where a line of sharply dressed people waited. The mayor, the banker, their lawyers, a few police officers. The mayor, a stocky man with a fixed smile, stepped forward, his eyes cool. "Mr. Callahan," he said smoothly, "we're sorry about yesterday. Boys will be boys. We've spoken to their families. We hope you'll understand." Tom stood quietly, his grey eyes steady. "Boys can change," Tom said gently, "but character needs to be taught." The mayor raised an eyebrow. "And what's that supposed to mean?" Tom didn't reply. Chuck stepped forward, his voice low, gravelly. "You know what my friend means," Chuck said evenly. "We're not asking for money, we're not suing anyone. We're asking for the boys to step up and own what they did, to give back to this town, to grow into better men." The air tightened, like a wire stretched between two poles. The mayor clenched his jaw. "Mr. Norris, this is local business. We don't need a movie star interfering." Chuck smiled faintly. "I'm not interfering. I'm just standing beside an old friend." Behind them, the crowd gathered again. People brought folding chairs. Some came with coffee, others with quiet determination. All eyes turned toward Tom. Some whispered, "He's standing up." Others shook their heads, murmuring, "This won't be easy." But no one left. The banker, the father of the tall boy, stepped forward with a chilly smirk. "Mr. Callahan, I respect your past, but this is a new world. Sometimes you need to know when to step back." Tom looked up, and in his gaze was a flicker of the man he'd once been. The young firefighter who had run into burning houses not because it was easy, but because it was right. "You know," Tom said calmly, "I've run into fires for kids I didn't know, for families without money, without titles, and I never once asked whose name was on the mailbox. I only asked one thing: could I help?" His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp, but it struck straight into the heart of the crowd, like a hammer breaking through cold stone. Chuck stood behind him, arms folded, watching with quiet intensity. He knew this moment mattered. This wasn't a fight over power. It was a fight to awaken the best in people. Suddenly, from behind the suits, the tall, shaved-head boy slipped forward, face pale, eyes red-rimmed. No one pushed him, no one pulled him. He came on his own, his steps shaky but determined. "Mr. Callahan," the boy's voice cracked. I'm sorry." The entire square went still. The boy bent in a clumsy, awkward bow, the first real act of humility in his life. A single tear rolled down his cheek, then another. Tom stepped forward, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. He said nothing, just gave a soft squeeze. One by one, the other boys emerged. No one ordered them, no one forced them. Something had stirred. The baker wiped at her eyes. The bookstore owner nodded quietly. A child on his father's shoulders clapped softly. Even the mayor and the banker shifted uneasily, watching as the boys they had tried to protect from consequence stepped into the light, no longer protected, but finally, maybe, respected. Chuck looked at Tom and gave a small, approving nod. "You did it." Tom looked back, his smile small but sure. "No, we did." At that moment, it felt like the entire town had taken a collective breath. A kind of hush settled over the square, not heavy or fearful, but charged, as if everyone sensed they were witnessing something rare, not punishment, not revenge, but redemption. As the boys stood awkwardly before Tom, the townspeople began to step forward. The barber crossed the street, arms folded, his eyes softening. The bookstore owner came with a small notebook, wiping her hands on her apron. The young couple with the baby approached, the mother whispering something to the child, who clapped tiny hands in delight. They didn't come with words of blame or sermons. They came with presence. Tom let out a long, slow breath, the kind that seemed to empty his chest not of air, but of a weight he had carried for years. He looked each boy in the eye. "I don't need you to fix the past," he said quietly, "but you can help shape what comes next." One boy swallowed hard, another shuffled his feet, but none of them walked away. And sometimes that's where change begins, not in grand apologies, but in the simple act of staying. Then something unexpected happened. From the back of the crowd, the mayor's wife stepped forward. She was a small woman, usually overshadowed by her husband's bluster, but now she carried a quiet determination as she approached Tom. "Mr. Callahan," she said gently, "my grandson. He has much to learn. We all do." Her voice trembled slightly, but she held Tom's gaze. "We'll make it right." Tom gave a small nod. "Thank you, Ma'am." The mayor, stiff in his tailored coat, shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Chuck, at Tom, at the crowd now closing ranks around them. He opened his mouth, as if to protest, but then closed it again. Some battles you know when you've lost. Others, you know, when you've been taught. And today, the lesson wasn't about power. It was about belonging. As the crowd began to disperse, small gestures filled the space between them. The baker brought a tray of warm cinnamon rolls, setting them on a bench near the watch shop. The gas station attendant carried over 2 cups of hot coffee. A boy darted forward with a folded note, pressed it into Tom's hand, and ran off before he could read it. Tom unfolded the note slowly. It read, in scrawled handwriting, "I'll help fix the watches. I want to learn." A smile crept across Tom's face, not wide, not showy, but real. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. As dusk fell, Chuck and Tom sat side by side on the shop steps. The square glowed under soft lamplight. The faint scent of pine and snow hung in the air, mixing with the buttery sweetness of pastries and the faint hum of laughter drifting from nearby homes. Chuck gave Tom a sideways glance. "Tired yet, old man?" Tom smiled softly, his eyes reflecting the lamplight like bits of polished silver. "For the first time in years," he murmured, "I feel awake." Chuck let out a low chuckle. "Well, don't go getting too lively on me. I don't want you running laps around the square." Tom laughed, a deep, rusty sound that felt like shaking off dust from long-used strings. "I think I'll just start with fixing a few watches." Chuck nodded approvingly. "Good place to start?" "No." The next morning, Tom awoke before dawn. Light crept in through the curtains, catching on the framed photograph of Martha on his nightstand. For a long moment, Tom sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on the old pocket watch she'd given him. The one he'd repaired so many times, it practically hummed with memory. He pressed his lips to the watch's cover. "Still here, Martha," he whispered. Still here. When he opened the shop that morning, he found a surprise. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. The boys, led by the tall, shaved-head one, stood ready, buckets and cloths in hand, cleaning the shop window, sweeping the stoop. The banker, their father, stood nearby, hands shoved deep in his pockets, watching with a strange mixture of embarrassment and pride. The bakery owner had left a tray of pastries on the bench. The gas station attendant leaned against a lamppost, sipping coffee, nodding quietly. And a few teenagers stood nervously at the edge of the sidewalk, clutching battered old watches they'd dug out of drawers at home. Tom pushed open the door. The bell above jingled brightly. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan. Need any help, Tom?" "Got a new sign for you, sir." Voices rose from all directions, weaving together into a kind of music, the everyday song of a town finding its heart again. Chuck leaned casually against a lamppost, arms crossed, eyes crinkling with quiet satisfaction. The tall boy approached, holding out a canvas bag filled with broken watch pieces. "We want to help fix them," he mumbled. "Could you show us how?" Tom looked down at the bag, his fingers brushing the cold metal bits. For a heartbeat he felt the old ache rise, the ache of years lost, of time slipped away. And then, as if carried on the wind, he heard Martha's voice in his mind. "Start small, teach them patience." Tom looked up, his eyes soft but steady. "Of course," he said. Let's begin with the art of patience. That entire day, the watch shop bustled like it hadn't in decades. People came in waves, some with old wristwatches, some with pocket watches from their grandparents, some with clocks they weren't even sure could be saved. Children peeked through the window, watching as Tom guided the boys' clumsy hands over tiny gears and delicate springs. Tom's fingers trembled slightly, but when they touched a watch, they steadied, as if his hands remembered what his heart had never forgotten. Chuck drifted in and out of the shop, sometimes standing on the sidewalk chatting with townsfolk, sometimes stepping inside to watch Tom work. He didn't interfere. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough, a quiet sentinel at the edge of a revival. Late in the afternoon, the bookstore owner brought over a leather-bound notebook. "For you, Tom," she smiled, "so you can write down these stories before they turn to whispers." Tom ran a hand over the smooth cover, his throat tightening. A boy from the group, the one with shaggy hair and skateboard shoes, grinned shyly and handed over a set of mismatched watch parts. "These were from my grandpa. Think we can make them work again?" Tom smiled gently. "Let's try." Outside, the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across Main Street. Laughter drifted from the bakery. Music floated softly from a guitar someone strummed near the square. For the first time in years, the town felt like itself. Not a place people passed through, but a place people paused to remember. Chuck leaned against the doorway, arms folded, watching as Tom leaned over the counter. The boys gathered close, their heads bent in concentration. The old man's voice, once nearly lost to dust and silence, now filled the room. Not with lectures, but with careful instructions, quiet encouragement, the occasional chuckle when a screw went skittering across the floor. As night settled in, Chuck stepped inside. "Ready to call it a day, Tom?" Tom looked up, eyes bright, cheeks a little pink from the excitement, a smear of grease across his sleeve. "Not just yet," he murmured. "One more watch." Chuck gave a knowing grin. "All right, one more, but then you're taking a break." Tom chuckled softly, turning back to his work. For a moment, Chuck simply stood there, memorizing the scene. The small room aglow with lamplight, the sound of laughter and quiet learning, the warmth of old hands guiding young ones. He felt something stir inside his chest, something like peace. Outside, the townspeople lingered, reluctant to let the night end. The mayor passed by, offering an awkward nod. The banker gave a short wave, his face a mix of gratitude and guilt. The bakery owner promised more pastries in the morning. The gas station attendant handed over 2 steaming mugs of coffee. A little boy darted forward and thrust a crumpled drawing into Tom's hand. A stick figure of an old man, a younger man, a cat, and a giant heart above them all. Tom smiled, eyes misting, folding the paper with care. When the final watch was set ticking again, Tom leaned back with a contented sigh. He looked at Chuck, voice soft but steady. "You know, I thought I'd forgotten how to live." Chuck's mouth curved into a slow smile. "Just needed someone to remind you." Tom let out a quiet laugh. "Guess we all do, sometimes." As they closed the shop and stepped onto the street, snow began to fall. Soft, slow, delicate flakes drifting from the sky like blessings. Chuck pulled his jacket tighter. Tom tilted his face up, letting the cold kiss his skin. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Tom murmured almost to himself, "Funny thing about time, we think it's our enemy, but maybe it's just been waiting for us to catch up." Chuck gave a low, thoughtful chuckle. "Maybe, old friend, maybe." That night, the watch shop glowed softly behind them as they walked home. 2 old souls in step with the town's reborn heartbeat. The square was quiet, the streets were hushed, but in every window a light flickered. In every home, a story stirred. And above it all, the town's clocks ticked on, not just keeping time, but carrying it forward, into hands now willing to hold it with care. A week later, on a crisp Sunday morning, the town gathered once more in the square. There were no reporters, no grand speeches, no cameras flashing, just people. Neighbors, friends, children bundled in scarves, elders leaning on canes, couples holding hands. At the center of it all stood Tom, wearing his old blue sweater, freshly mended by the bookstore owner's wife. Beside him, Chuck stood quietly, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, watching over his friend like a steadfast shadow. A small plaque had been placed near the square's old oak tree. It didn't bear Tom's name, because he had insisted it shouldn't. Instead, it read, Memory Square, to remind us who we are when no one's watching. The mayor read the words out loud, his voice catching at the end. For a moment, silence swept through the crowd, soft as falling snow. Then, one by one, people came forward. The bakery owner placed a basket of fresh rolls near the plaque. The banker brought his son, who handed Tom a folded note reading, "Thank you for showing me how to be better." The boys from the shop lined up, each carrying a small, ticking watch they'd helped repair. A little girl pressed a paper heart into Tom's hands and whispered, "You're my hero." Tom's eyes filled, his throat tight with words he didn't know how to speak. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the square, Chuck leaned toward Tom, murmuring with a grin, "Not bad for a forgotten old man, huh?" Tom let out a warm, shaky laugh. "Yeah, not bad at all." Yes. Later, after the crowd drifted home, after the children's laughter faded into quiet streets, Tom and Chuck sat together on the shop steps. The sky was streaked with the last blush of day, the first stars pricking through the dark. In the distance, the town's clocks chimed the hour, soft, clear, steady. Tom cradled Martha's pocket watch in his hands, fingers brushing the inscription inside. "Forever yours, Martha." He closed his eyes, breathed in the cold, clean air, and whispered, "I'm still here, love, and I think I always will be." Chuck rested a hand on Tom's shoulder, silent and sure. When Chuck finally rose to leave, Tom gripped his hand tightly. "Thank you, Chuck," he murmured, "for everything." Chuck squeezed back. "No," he said softly. "Thank you, Tom, for reminding all of us that we're still capable of remembering." That night, as the town settled into sleep, as lights dimmed and fires crackled low, a gentle ticking filled the little watch shop. Not just the sound of gears and springs, not just the keeping of hours, but the heartbeat of a town newly awake. The end.